Welcome to another episode of No Power Panel. This week we're joined by Senator Yuen Pau Woo, an independent senator for British Columbia, and one of the few voices in Ottawa willing to speak honestly about Canada's role in Gaza. Senator Woo recently introduced a motion in the Senate calling for an independent investigation into Canada's complicity in the genocide in Gaza, a move that's drawn backlash across party lines, including an attempt by conservative senators to silence him on October 7th when he tried to speak about it in the chamber. For years, Senator Woo has been known for his thoughtful, independent approach to foreign policy and governance, but this moment marks something different, a moral stand against the quiet conformity that defines Canada's political class. Today, we talk about why he brought the motion forward, what he's seen behind closed doors in Parliament, and what it means to speak truth in a system built on silence. Senator Woo joins us now. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So first, I want to understand what motivated you to present this motion in the Senate now.
Well, it was frustration over more than 2 years of inaction and worse complicity, I think, on the part of many Canadians in leadership positions for allowing serious violations of international law to take place in Gaza. And the kind of justification and backfilling of why we did what we did was okay that I saw across Ottawa and across the country. You know, for a long time, I figured that Canada, being what it is, would respond in the appropriate way, of course, subject to all the political realities of geopolitics, but Canada would respond fundamentally out of what we've always said is our adherence to international law, respond out of compassion and humanitarian instinct, as we have said on many issues around the world. But I've more or less given up that the government of Canada, anyway, is going to respond on the basis of adherence to international law or out of compassion. And so I decided that the only way to get Canada and the government to take this issue more seriously is to ask about complicity and to see if that threat of legal sanction would be enough for us to change our course, or at the very least face up to the double standards and the contradictions that we've been displaying over the last 2 years.
Okay. Now, speaking of parliamentarians and political staff who aren't taking things as seriously as you would like them to, maybe, how common is the disconnect between kind of a private maybe sense of horror that they express behind the scenes at the images that we all see on our feeds and on the news about what's going on, and the unwillingness to say anything public in your experience in having private dealings with people without obviously exposing confidences or anything like that?
Sure, there's a huge gulf, I think, in the attitudes and responses of many of my colleagues who I think understand very well what is going on. They may or may not have come to the same conclusion as I have, that there's a genocide, but the vast majority of senators know that something very wrong has gone on. Israel has perpetrated some serious violations of international law, and that Canada hasn't done enough. I mean, these things are incontrovertible, I believe. But many of them, most of them, bless their souls, are afraid to speak out for a variety of reasons, partly because the government line is that things are they're not going fine, but we're doing what we can. The government
Right.
line for the longest time was that there were no war crimes, there was no obstruction of humanitarian aid, there was no targeting of civilians. This was the official government line. It was uttered, directly in response to questions that I posed in the Senate of Canada. So senators are cautious to go against the official position, but I think the more important restraint on many of my colleagues is the fear of being labeled an anti-Semite or being called a Hamas terrorist sympathizer. This is a very powerful conversation stopper, let's call it, that pro-Israel forces have effectively mobilized. And it's a shame that the rest of us many of us have succumbed to it.
Certainly. And at this point, maybe I'll provide the disclaimer that I feel like I often have to when we're talking about this on the podcast, which is that I'm Jewish. Um, and I wish that wasn't something that needed to be said almost as a preemptive defense on my part, but unfortunately, that's where we're at this point.
Well, thank you for
So
sharing that. Thank you for sharing that with us.
absolutely, absolutely. So sorry, I'm just finding myself in my notes here. Um, Now let's talk about specifically what happened around your speech on October 7th and the Conservatives' attempt to procedurally shut you down. Can you briefly describe what happened in that moment for our audience who might not be up on the exact day-to-day maneuverings?
Well, some of it is very much inside baseball, but I'll give you an
Mhm.
abridged version.
Sure.
First thing to say is that my motion was signaled 3 months before I spoke to it. I had given what they call notice of the motion in June. And then I had signaled very clearly to all senators that I would be speaking on it, on the motion on October 7th. So this was no surprise. I did not spring it on anyone.
Mhm.
Um, when I began my speech, I got about a minute into my oration when Senator Pamela Wallin, who is with the Canadian Senators Group, got up and raised a point of order. The point of order was that I was using sharp and taxing language. This is again an archaic rule in the Senate that correctly tries to get senators to speak in a dignified way. Of course, the grounds for her complaint was that I used the word genocide. She said she didn't agree with my characterization of the situation in Gaza and said that the use of the word genocide was sharp and taxing. Now, I mean, you don't have to be a parliamentary rules expert to understand that the word genocide in itself is not sharp and taxing. The word is very troubling, of course, and she is right to be troubled by that word, as you should be, and I should be, and all Canadians should be. If she disagrees with the characterization, she's, of course, entitled to debate it. But the long and the short of it is that the point of order was not upheld by the speaker. I was able to continue with my speech, but of course it was an unnecessary disruption. I would say, though, some people may be wondering why I chose to speak on a day like October 7th. And some senators, I think, rightly had some second thoughts about why I was choosing to make this very difficult speech on a day that's sensitive to many Jewish people and Israelis in particular. And the reason is because I wanted to express my horror at what happened on October 7th, my sympathy for all the victims of October 7th, and to say that what happened on October 7th and every day after is precisely why we need to remember the Holocaust and what the Holocaust demands of us. And what it demands of us, Noam, is that we never again, as the phrase goes, never again, never again, never again allow a genocide to take place. It is precisely that I have the deepest reverence for international Holocaust remembrance, that we have to talk about the aftermath of October 7th and face up to the fact that we in Canada allowed again what we said to be never again.
Yes, absolutely. Um, just as a personal anecdote, I, of course, as somebody who's Jewish and grew up going to synagogue, the amount of people that I personally know who I said never again with constantly at synagogue and services, and have not said a single word to criticize the genocidal images that we see is really quite shocking. I reached out to my synagogue starting in, I think, November of 2023, when I started calling what was going on a genocide. Um, and after a series of emails that I sent, I was banned for life for attending my synagogue. And so this is kind of leading to me asking about the role of Zionism in Canadian society today, and your views of the government's role around advocating for or not the continued spread of a Zionist political ideology.
Well, one of the biggest contributors to our complicity or our lack of action in the war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide in Gaza is the government's not just tacit but overt support for narratives in this country that suppress um, critiques of Israel, that suppress empathy and support for Palestinian justice, and which in fact punish individuals who want to speak out against Israel in a very strong way. We've had two prime ministers now, who declare themselves as Zionists in one form or another. Perhaps they're using an idiosyncratic definition of Zionism that is simply about the right of Israel to exist, to be a state, which I support entirely. But the version of Zionism we're seeing uh, through Benjamin Netanyahu and unfortunately more and more Israelis is one that is an apartheid state. It's a state that has two classes of citizens. It's one that is expansionist, that explicitly supports the taking of Palestinian territory by force or other coercive means, and one which has been used to justify the obliteration of Gaza. How can you be a Zionist if that is the version of Zionism that we are talking about? The government's, the prime minister's, endorsement of Zionism has given succor to those who have been supporting the the genocide in Gaza, and that's been a major reason why Canada has been so slow to act, and a major reason why so many of my colleagues have been afraid to speak out.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. Um, In relation to that, as a longtime political observer and actor now, how do you find the atmosphere is different specifically around the genocide and apartheid in the Israel-Palestine situation versus the moral climate that existed around things like Rwanda or South Africa or similar levels of atrocity that have occurred internationally?
Well, the double standards are glaring. To be fair, we also tolerated apartheid in South Africa and in many ways, supported the Afrikaner state for many years as
Mhm.
fellow travelers in the colonial enterprise. We did not recognize the Rwandan genocide for 10 years. It was my colleague, we didn't overlap, but former Senator General Romeo Dallaire who
Mhm.
sounded the alarm, and he had to swim upstream, right, to get Canadians to recognize what went wrong. By the way, he has come out to say that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide as well. We celebrated him on Rwanda, and we would accept everything he said, with respect and honor. But here on the case of Gaza, nobody's paying attention. It's really a stark example of how we pick and choose our causes based on domestic political calculations, based on a kind of ideological brainwashing, and based on coercion,
Mhm.
semantic and epistemic coercion that has been brewing in this country for many years because of a very powerful pro-Israel lobby that has uh, deeply, deeply influenced many, many parliamentarians. If you only look at the number of parliamentarians who've traveled to Israel, on Tel Aviv's dime, you get an indication of how deep that, let's not even call it influence, let's call it foreign interference. You get a
Yeah,
sense of how deep that foreign interference has been.
absolutely. No, it's startling the way that they use these trips to Israel for both parliamentarians and Jewish people and people with Jewish ancestry to really capture them into that ideology. Several of my cousins went on birthright trips, and the things that they described having experienced getting back is just outrageous to think about. You've connected the genocide in Gaza, uh, both here now and in past interviews, with Canada's own colonial past. Do you think that the historical complicity makes it harder for politicians here to call out colonial violence elsewhere in the world?
It shouldn't. It should be the opposite, shouldn't it? Because
Absolutely.
I wouldn't say we've fully come to terms, but we've begun a process of truth and reconciliation. It took us, over 100 years to get to that point. Maybe that's the example, and that's the sadly the path that we're on. I hope it doesn't take 100 years, but this is the way it works, right? History is written by the victors, sad to say. We want to be on the winning side, whether it's winning in the sense of being cozying up to, the big power that's brokering peace, or the winner in terms of economic and other benefits. And it may take us a long time to come to terms with our role in Gaza, but I'm trying to accelerate that process.
Mhm.
And I think reference to our role in the treatment of indigenous peoples in this country should be helpful. Uh, but I think most of our political leaders, even those who are the most outspoken on indigenous rights, are able to compartmentalize the issues in their brains such that the synapses from one side don't connect with the other.
Absolutely makes sense. Um, So then turning to your specific motion on Canada's complicity, now that we've kind of established some of the background and your thoughts on the situation in general, um, do you want to just kind of briefly summarize what your motion is calling for the Parliament in Canada to do?
Yes, of course. The motion calls on Canada to examine the risk of complicity on the part of the government and on the part of Canadians in violations of international law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and to produce a report within 3 months of the adoption of the motion. And I should say the motion also talks about how the war crimes and other violations of international law have been documented in advisories and instructions from the International Court of Justice, more recently by the UN and other international bodies. So there's a basis for which Canada has to take the question of complicity seriously. It's not Yuen Pau Woo making a gentle request, as a whim. It is that the courts have said, the International Court of Justice has said, we are warning all states that you are at risk of complicity if you continue to have material relations with Israel and aid in their ability to commit these crimes. So the motion is really just a way of getting our government to come to terms with how we let a genocide happen when all the information was available to us, when we had some tools to apply, trade tools, tools of sanction, tools related to the shipment and trade of arms and military equipment. How do we let this happen? Uh, and I'm hoping that if the government does in fact produce the report, it will allow Canadian society more broadly to also ask the question of how we let ourselves get into a position uh, where we aided and abetted genocide in Gaza. And I'm talking about universities, I'm talking about professional bodies like medical associations, I'm talking about hospitals, I'm talking about major corporations, I'm talking about labor unions, really all of the institutions of influence and power in Canadian society that I think have been confronted with this issue one way or the other, perhaps because some of their members have raised it with them. How did they react? Did they shut down, the protests from one of their members saying that maybe we should do something to cut off ties with Israel? Did they accuse their members of being anti-Semites because they raised these questions? Or did they take a good faith approach to try and wrestle with what is ultimately not just a moral responsibility? In international law, these kinds of serious violations of international law are what they call jus cogens or peremptory obligations that apply to everyone, right down to corporations and individuals. We cannot run away from reckoning with our responsibility. And my motion ultimately is not just about getting the government to come to terms with what happened, but also to get Canadian society at large to ask those same questions.
Excellent. That's really important work. I'm assuming that there's a vote happening on your motion. What are the details around that?
Sure. Well, the motion is on the what they call the order paper, the agenda.
Mhm.
Three senators have spoken to it, myself and Senator Pate, as well as Senator Gerber. I invite your listeners to check out Senator Pate's speech and Senator Gerber's speech. Excellent, excellent points that they made. It has now been adjourned, which means that other senators can speak to it. I hope other senators will speak to it. I even encourage senators who disagree with the motion to speak to it. That's the point of a Senate debate. But at some point, I would like to see this motion come to a vote. Of course, I'd like to see it pass, but senators vote the way they see fit. If it passes, then the 3-month clock starts to tick, and the government is, I wouldn't say obliged. I mean, they could refuse, but there's a requirement for the government to respond within 3 months. And let me just say that I expect that we will be ready for a vote probably by early or mid-November, and I will encourage my colleagues to bring it to a vote. But I fully expect that there will be some senators who will try to block the vote from happening on the pretext that they want to speak or that they want to take more time to do research and basically avoid the question.
Gotcha. Yes. Delay tactics always finding a way in. So listeners, watchers, call your senators, let them know that you want this to be spoken to and then to come to a vote. We'd love to help make that happen.
Well, and to be clear again, I
Hmm.
encourage my colleagues to speak in any direction. If they
Hmm.
disagree, I'd love to hear from them. I'd love to hear why they think there weren't serious violations of international law, or I'd like to hear why they think it's not necessary for us to examine how we let these horrors take place. Tell us. Maybe you can convince some of your colleagues.
Maybe we'll see, but absolutely we want to make that happen. If that does come to a vote and it passes, and we do eventually see a report from the government around this, what steps would you like to see taken around those that are considered to be complicit in the war crimes that Israel has perpetrated?
Well, first of all, this report calls on the government to look at Canada's complicity.
Hmm.
So, of course, that's premised on Israel's uh, role in making the genocide possible in the first place. And there are related questions around impunity, around justice, around the prosecution of war crimes and other crimes, the role of the international courts. All of those questions are up for grabs and they should be addressed in this report. But the narrower scope of the report is about Canadian complicity in allowing this to happen. Could we have done more? Why didn't we do more? And so on. Now, I don't know what the report will produce, if there is a report at all. Of course, the instinct of the government almost certainly is to plead plausible deniability. Oh, we didn't know soon enough, we did what we could, we had to be realistic. We're now focused on the future, we'll focus on peace, we'll focus on rebuilding, we'll focus on the two-state solution. So let's not get bogged down with what went wrong in the past. Almost certainly we're going to get that kind. In fact, we're getting it already, right? We're
Yeah.
hearing from our leaders, focus on the future. Absolutely, we want peace in the region. We want Palestinians to be able to go back to their homes. We want the rebuilding we want to take place. We want humanitarian aid to go in massive quantities. But you cannot have peace without justice. And while we want to focus on peace and reconstruction and humanitarian assistance immediately, we cannot take our eye off justice. So anyway, to make a long story short, I don't know what the report will produce, but if they do come up with a report that's all about plausible deniability, make the case. Make the case, and
Yeah.
Canadians can decide for themselves. And then maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we have a bit more distance and objectivity and a bit more humility, maybe we'll look at this report and say, boy, that was bullshit, wasn't it? You know? I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just guessing, right? But this is why
absolutely.
I'm saying ultimately, this motion is not just about the Canadian government. The Canadian government, they're between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to deal with Trump. They're trying to deal with getting reelected. You've got uh, people using the anti-Semitism argument, not just in the Liberal Party, but the Conservative Party, the NDP as well. So, it's a tough position there, and I'm not unsympathetic, but put it out there for Canadians to see. Let's have a national conversation about complicity.
Absolutely makes sense. Um, so turning to kind of the situation now, because we have the ceasefire deal that has been implemented, how do you think the path forward goes for the situation on the ground? What do you think can be done to now prevent further complicity around any further war crimes that might be happening during the ceasefire period, like further annexation of the West Bank?
Well, that's a good way of putting it because if we are sensitive to the fact that there is a complicity risk, then that risk continues. It doesn't stop because
Mhm.
a deal has been made or a ceasefire is in place. And even as the world and the major players in the ceasefire deal focus on humanitarian aid, rebuilding, getting Palestinians back to their homes, we need voices in the international community that are alert to the ongoing risk of further crimes against humanity, genocide, and we need voices in the international community that are committed to justice and not allowing impunity. I'd like to think that Canada can be one of those voices. In some ways, the fact that we have now recognized the state of Palestine creates an even greater onus on us to adhere and uphold international law for the state of Palestine. Recognizing the state of Palestine cannot be without meaning. It has to give some power to Palestinians, including, of course, the power to rebuild, the power to live in peace, the power to go back to their homes, but also the power of righting wrongs, getting justice, and correcting the historical record.
Okay, makes sense. Um, we're working through my list of questions very quickly, so I just want to kind of maybe veer off from what my planned question was for a moment and just ask what drew your attention to the Israel-Palestine situation in the first place?
That's a really good question. I don't pretend to be a Middle East expert and much less a Israel-Palestine expert. But like you and like most Canadians, I follow the news. I'm a foreign policy guy, an international relations guy, so I follow international events very closely. And I could see the horror unfold. I was, I think, the first senator to ask a question of the government about what seemed to be, even in those early days, an unfolding genocide. The answer I got was so incredulous, so textbook Israel that I was determined to dig deeper into it. What really pushed me over the edge, if I can put it that way,
Mhm.
was a bill that was tabled last year. It was in its final kind of third reading. It was about to become law. The bill was to declare April as Arab Heritage Month. Perfectly innocuous bill, if I can put it that way. It had
Mhm.
it had gone through the House without any difficulty. There were a number of speakers in the Senate. Not one speaker mentioned the existential threat to Arab heritage. you know? Not one speaker. I mean, everybody talked about how wonderful the Arabs in Canada are, how we love their food, how we love their
Right.
customs, how they've made great contributions. All of this is true. All of it, I heartily agree, and how we
Mhm.
need to celebrate Arab heritage, but totally ignoring the single biggest issue for Arab Canadians today, and I would say Arabs around the world, which is what's
Yeah.
happening in Palestine. So I had to do a crash course on what was happening in Palestine, and I gave a speech on Arab Heritage Month. I mean, why am I speaking on Arab Heritage Month? But my
Right.
speech was all about the the elephant in the room and how we do Arab Canadians a massive injustice. If we pass a bill talking about their food and their culture and what lovely people they are, what a great language they have, and we don't acknowledge the suffering that they are going through because of what's happening in Palestine. That's how I got into the issue. And I'm still not an expert. I've read a lot more. I've met with a lot of Jewish friends and Palestinian friends and experts on the issue who've educated me. I've come to learn how much I've also been uh, indoctrinated, I suppose, and how I've bought into narratives about Israel-Palestine that are faulty.
Yeah. It's it's an interesting experience to wake up to just how infusive into people who aren't, as you say, Jewish or Arab or Palestinian, just kind of sit with those narratives that have worked their way into our culture. Um, what do you think it is about the word genocide that people have such trouble with around this? I mean, I I've been calling this a genocide since mid-October of 2023, and at the time I had friends and family saying to me, tone it down, that's not what this is. And I was looking around going, well, they've cut off the water, the food, the whatever else. They're bombing them indiscriminately. Like, at what point do you call it that? And then we've seen more and more people kind of wake up to that reality. But there's still so much. It was that word in particular that had other senators objecting during your speech last week. What do you think it is about that word that people have such a problem accepting?
Well, it's a crime of crimes, right? That's how it's described in international law. It's the most extreme violation of human dignity, not just to an individual, but to a whole group of individuals based on religion, ethnicity, or so on and so on. And so it's repulsive. And I totally understand why all of us should be repulsed by the word, including my colleague, Senator Pam Wallen. She's right to be repulsed by the word. She's right to
It
be horrified that I've used the word. But then the question is it accurate? And look, I will be the first to say that I'm very hesitant to use the word genocide because it's bandied about very loosely in many situations. But the fact that, and I've come to this realization somewhat recently,
Mhm.
the fact that one should be very, very careful about labeling any incident, any horror a genocide, the fact that one should be very cautious about it should mean that when it does happen, when the weight of evidence is so overwhelming that you are not afraid to say the word. Because if you are still afraid to say the word, when the evidence is so overwhelming, then you do an injustice to all of the other uh, atrocities and horrors and crimes that may not amount to a genocide. And I think many people are afraid, with some justification, that if they say this is a genocide in Palestine, then there will be genocides popping up everywhere. Everything will be called genocide. Of course, we have to be careful of that, but that doesn't mean that we don't call out a genocide when we see it. And honestly, the weight of evidence surely is enough.
Absolutely. Totally agree. What lessons can younger activists and politicians take from how power and powerful people have responded to these sorts of moral challenges in Gaza?
Well, it's all about narrative, right? It's all about framing the debate in ways that either allow for voice and dissent, or framing narratives in such a way that they shut down dissent and shut down in the most draconian and harmful ways. What I call conversation stoppers, where the mere utterance of the term anti-Semitism is enough to stop a conversation in its tracks. It's happened. It's happening right now as we speak. And when the government, this is the shame of it, when the government puts its weight behind definitions of anti Semitism and understandings of Zionism that effectively shut down legitimate quests and pleas for justice, they are complicit in the horror that is taking place. So for young people, yes, we have to point out what the horror that's going on in Gaza. How much more do we need to point out? I mean, like, how many more pictures do I need to show my colleagues to convince them that something horrible is going on? Surely that's not the problem now. The problem is that we have trapped ourselves into a framing of the issue that does not allow us to translate what we see on our phones and our TV screens, the horror we see, to translate that into describing it the way it is. We've blocked the channel. The synapse is broken, Left brain, right brain doesn't work anymore. And
Yeah,
that's what young people need to focus on, reframing the narrative so that we are allowed to say things as they are.
perfect. So, given that, my final question is if you could say one thing directly to your fellow senators, members of parliament, uh, Canadians with a platform to say or do something on this issue, what would be your kind of 1 minute appeal to them on this?
Well, I would say that one day, maybe 6 months from now, maybe 6 years from now, sadly, maybe 6 years from now, we will all agree that a genocide took place in Gaza, that the world, including Canada, failed Palestinians miserably, and that this was a very dark period, uh, particularly for Western countries that claim to have a certain moral standing and commitment to international law. This will be a sad chapter for all of us. And we will all agree on this, I believe, in time. And there's a simple rule, in life, which is that if something's going to happen, uh, and you can see it coming, you should get there sooner rather than later. I understand everybody needs to take the time to be comfortable with changing the way one thinks about the problem. One has to be mindful of the fact that taking a position in Palestine can harm your own professional prospects. It can harm friendships. I've lost friends. I'm sad to say I've made new friends as well. There's a cost to all of this, but it's going to happen. We're going to recognize that there was a genocide and that we failed. Let's recognize that sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much for saying that, for joining us today, for being a leader on this issue where we have too few of them in positions like yours. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of No Power Panel. We're all grateful for what you've done. If people are wanting to follow your efforts or whatever like that, where do you want to direct them to?
My website, Senator Yuen Pau Woo.ca. I'm on X, I'm on Insta, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on LinkedIn, all of the usual platforms. I'm not a big social media guy, really, but
Okay.
I want to get the word out. More importantly, I want you to get the word out to your friends and colleagues, to my colleagues in the Senate and the House. Uh, the threat is still there. The genocide is ongoing. The ceasefire could well collapse. And even if the ceasefire persists, the rights of Palestinians could well still be suppressed. So we have to be vigilant.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Wu. Well, I'd like to thank Senator Wu for joining us on today's episode of No Power Panel. It was a really interesting conversation to have with the senator about the realities of the situation relating to the Gaza genocide here in Canada and his efforts to bring accountability for Canada's own complicity in the war crimes being committed by Israel. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think Canada has been complicit? What do you think should be done to Canadians who we uncover the complicity of? What do you think should be done as a consequence to government ministers and government officials who have been complicit in this genocide? What do you think should be done to Canadians who have gone to Israel to serve in the IDF during this and committed these war crimes directly? We already know of several, and I'm sure more will be uncovered eventually. So the question is now up to the government, up to Parliament through this motion that Senator Wu has presented in the Senate, and up to us, the Canadian people. What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of people do we want to be welcome in that society? Do war criminals belong in Canadian civil society? Do war criminals belong in Canadian public office? Do they belong teaching our children, working in our hospitals, working in our public spaces, leading our government? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments on what should be done about those in Canada and around the world who we uncover are complicit in Israel's war crimes. Personally, I think that The Hague is a pretty good place for anyone who we uncover has been linked in any way to these war crimes or has been complicit in them. Thank you for joining this episode of No Power Panel. It's been a great one, like I said. I'd like to extend thanks to Senator Wu and his staff for his joining this conversation, for his work on this issue, for his leadership on such a vital key point of Canadian law. Please, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Check us out on Patreon. Very cheap, couple of bucks a month to help support and make this show possible. And also, exclusive Patreon videos will be starting this week. I already have the first one ready to go, so keep a watch out for that. And we will be posting a sample of it here to the channel to let you know the kinds of things that will be available on the Patreon. Like I said, please like, comment, subscribe, follow, all of that good stuff, and have a great day. Thanks for joining an episode of No Power Panel.